This is U.S. History, Chapter 7, Section 4, Americans at War. So, by 1917, the war was not going well for the Allied forces. Russia had since backed out of the war, and so the Germans did not have to split their forces between the Western and Eastern fronts, and they moved a lot of their forces from the Eastern Front, where they were fighting the Russians, back into the Western Front to fight the rest of the Allies, England and France. German U-boats were still continuing to sink Allied ships at a high rate that carried valuable war supplies. They actually sank 844 Allied ships up to this point. That's a lot. That's a lot of supplies. The United States, now that they were joining the war, they offered three really important things: a strong navy to protect these supply ships from these German U-boats, fresh soldiers. The soldiers in England and France have been fighting for 3 years now. Pretty much they've exhausted their uh, soldier resources. There wasn't really many left to draft, so whatever soldiers were out there were available. They were out there fighting, and new war supplies. France obviously was the fighting was happening there, so it was hard to manufacture things. And then England was just running out of supplies to make anything. But the United States had a lot to offer. So the first thing to do was protect these supply lines. And what the American Navy developed was the convoy system. So what the convoy system did was that a large group of merchant ships would sail across the Atlantic from the United States, but they were surrounded by a bunch of warships, American warships, destroyers. The convoy system worked really well, and the sinking of U.S. supply ships greatly diminished because German U-boats were more easily spotted if there's a lot of ships out there. And if they were spotted, if they did try to sink something, the United States destroyers could easily see them and try to attack the German U-boats. It was just a safer way to go across the Atlantic Ocean, strength in numbers kind of a system. The U.S. Army chose John J. Pershing, Blackjack, to command the American forces in Europe. We talked about him in previous chapters. He was known for leading the pursuit against Pancho Villa into Mexico, because remember Pancho Villa killed some Americans in New Mexico, and then John J. Pershing went into Mexico looking for Pancho Villa. That was the same guy. He received his nickname Blackjack because he was formerly led the all African American 10th Cavalry. So it was an all black cavalry unit, so that's kind of how he got his name. John is another nickname for John is Jack, so that's how he got his name. So the United States Army during World War I was known by the Allied forces as the American Expeditionary Force. That's what they were known as. And the soldiers were called doughboys in Europe when they got there. There's some dispute of why they were called doughboys, but one of the claims is that during the Mexican-American War, which happened in about the 1840s, the American soldiers were covered in dust from the desert, and they kind of looked like they were dough covered in flour, like if you ever make cookies. There's a lot of flour going on, and so that was one reason why they might have been called doughboys. But American soldiers, when they got over into Europe, they were called doughboys. And this is the typical dress of a American World War I soldier. The way to tell it's a World War I soldier is the helmet. It's kind of flat on the top and has a wide brim, and also they have kind of like this high sock and kind of flared out pants. That's definitely World War I. So the Allied forces, Great Britain and France, were very relieved the American soldiers finally joined them in June of 1917. The U.S. Army did not fight with the French and British units. Really, they fought in their own separate unit themselves. So it's not like they were backup for France and Britain England at first. And there was a reason for this. President Wilson wanted to show the world that the U.S. military is just as powerful as any other uh, European nation. It's hard to think that the United States wasn't the most powerful military uh, in the world today, but during World War One, over 100 years ago, that was the case. The United States just wasn't seen as that. It wasn't because they never fought against European powers for quite some time. And President Wilson wanted to show the world if the United States wants to be a world leader and be respected, they had to show that we had a really powerful army. Citizens of France, they were more than welcoming to the American soldiers. They had parades and cheered like, oh, finally, fresh soldiers, fresh supplies. We're finally going to win the war. And then not so good news for the Allied forces is that the new Russian government, the communist government in Russia, well, they signed this peace treaty called the Brest-Litovsk Treaty with Germany in November of 1917. The Russian army Russia gave Germany 30% of Russia's territory in Eastern Europe. That's a lot. And so they pretty much, where the line was where the Germans were able to invade, they were able to draw the line there, and that's what Germany was able to keep. And officially, all the fighting officially ended on the Eastern Front. So after the peace treaty, Germany, like I said before, was able to send all their soldiers to the Eastern Front and bolster up, from the Eastern Front to the Western Front to bolster up their lines. So this is pretty much as far as the Germans got during the fighting, and that's kind of where the line was drawn during the treaty. And so then they were allowed to send their troops over to the Western Front over here because no more fighting was going on here. So even with fresh American soldiers, the Allies were still at a stalemate. Germans were resupplied with fresh soldiers from the east, and the battling continued. So the Germans wanted with this new resupply of men, they wanted to throw a big punch at the Western Front against the Allied forces before too many American soldiers were able to come across, and they called this the peace offensive. Germany wanted to defeat the Allied forces and bring peace under German terms, similar to their treaty with Russia. They wanted to gain just as much land on the Western Front as they did on the Eastern Front. By June 1918, Germany had pushed the Allies further into France. They're throwing all their weight into the Western Front was working, and 1 million French citizens did need to relocate. The lines of the trenches were moving. The Allied forces were being pushed back. Germans were striking hard and fast, and like I said, they wanted to do that before too many American soldiers arrived, and the Allied forces were supplied too much. So this is their massive offensive in the spring and early summer of 1918. So they're pushing, that was the line, and now they're pushing forward. So they're getting closer and closer to Paris. American and French soldiers were able to counterattack the German offensive, and they were not able to push as far. The German army was not able to push as far as they would like. One of the first and most famous battles for the United States during World War I was a unit of United States Marines. They were given their own task to clear out and take the heavily fortified position that the Germans had at Belleau Wood. It's a strategic place. It was kind of like the Germans' furthest point into France in the middle, and the Allied forces needed to push them back out of these woods. Like I said, this was probably the first major fight that the American troops had solely, and they wanted to make a statement in this battle that the Americans can hold their own and do what's necessary. But the Marines suffered heavy losses, but did succeed in driving the Germans out of their position. About 10,000 Marines were dead or wounded after the battle. As you can see, it was just they were going into this heavily fortified woods. It's hard to tell in a thick woods what's going on. And you can see some hand-to-hand combat going on, but the United States Marines were successful. So after launching all these successful, strong offensive attacks, it really did take a toll of the German army. They kind of depleted their resources doing these attacks. That was kind of their last effort. If it wasn't successful, the German army wasn't going to last too much longer. And they did lose 800,000 men in these 6 months in all these attacks. It was just a number that Germany could not afford to lose to continue the war. And but even so, the Allied forces were losing men too. But with the Americans, with fresh troops arriving every day, Germany just could not keep up with the resupplied Allied forces. And eventually, by midsummer of 1918, Germans and the German army just didn't want the war really to go on much longer, and we're kind of losing the will to fight after 4 years of intense battling. And by September 1918, 1 million U.S. soldiers had advanced on German strongholds, so the U.S. had fresh troops, and they kind of went bold over the German army and were able to defeat them at the Meuse River and Argonne Forest, and they were just crushing the German defenses. So by November 1918, German leaders realized that with the Americans joining the war now and all the Allied forces getting resupplied, there was just no hope in continuing to fight. And the U.S. would just keep on coming, and they were just supplying the Allied forces, and there was no end in sight. So the German leaders sought an armistice. And what that is a halt in fighting so both sides can talk about the peace and ending of a war. So an armistice is just calling for a cease of fire so peace talks can be had. England and France, who have suffered for the past 4 years of war against Germany, wanted to dictate the terms of the armistice and planned to be very strict with the German surrender. They weren't going to be easy on them. And England and France demanded certain things, like all soldiers to retreat from the Western Front. Germany had to give back lands they gained with a peace treaty with Russia. And Germany had to surrender all U-boats. Stop sinking the ships. The U-boats were still an issue, but these were their terms. The German monarch, which is like a king, Kaiser Wilhelm, also needed to abdicate or step down from the throne as part of this armistice. So the Allied forces were not going to stop fighting and attacking Germany until they agreed to these conditions. Germany did agree to these conditions, and they became a republic with future elected officials. So the king, or Kaiser Wilhelm, he stepped down, and then now Germany can be a republic. They stopped sending the retreat. There was no more German soldiers on the Western Front. Germany gave back lands, surrendered their U-boats, and now it's time for peace talks. So on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, the armistice came into effect, and the war was finally over. So that's a fancy way of saying what it was, but it's November 11th at 11 a.m. 1918, 11th month, November 11th day, 11th hour. The armistice came into effect. And it was known for a long time, it was known as Armistice Day. But here in the United States, we kind of turned Armistice Day into a day we call Veterans Day. And when we honor all military personnel, but in Europe, they mainly honor that was finally the day that the World War I was over. So what a horrific war it was. Remember, After the war, it was not called World War One because there was only one World War at the time, and they called it the Great War, and it was a great war. 10 million soldiers died on all sides during World War One. Germany suffered 1.6 million, France 1.3, Russia had 1.7, England close to a million, and then United States, even though they were only in the war less than a year, they still suffered 50,000. Millions of soldiers were wounded too. Like I said, the gas attacks. They were blinded. They lost limbs, lung damage, and just other psychological damage during problems during the war from months of fighting in the trenches. Just a lot were so many people were affected. Pretty much a whole generation of young men in Europe were killed, like a whole entire generation. Another 10 million civilians died during the war. So it wasn't just soldiers, just Europe was just war torn. And civilians are non military men, women, and children. Just people living, these towns were getting invaded in Europe, bombings. People were dying of starvation, disease. Their homes were destroyed. Much of northern France was destroyed. Millions of children in Europe became orphans. Europe was in pieces after the war. And then after November 11th, 1918, Europe started a long road to recover from the horrific scene after World War One.